And we will start our first part, with the transatlantic relations. And it's a pleasure to have with us Thibaut, who is the Chief Policy and Public Affairs Officer at AmCham EU. He will help us to better understand the scale, depth, and strategic importance of the transatlantic economy. EU actually, and Thibaut has consistently provided some of the most in-depth analysis on US-Europe economic ties, investment flows, and sectoral trends. Thibaut will walk us through the key findings shaping the transatlantic economic outlook for 2026 based on the annual Transatlantic Economy Report published in collaboration with AmCham EU, the US Chamber of Commerce, Johns Hopkins University, and the Transatlantic Leadership Network, and supported by several AmChams, including our AmCham Greece. Thibaut, welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Elias, and it's really a pleasure to join you all today or this afternoon, this morning, depending on where you sit. And just to say, indeed, thank you so much to AmCham Greece for the support to this research, which is really valuable to us. And so I'll quickly walk you through some of the findings. I think, as Elias mentioned, we are at a pivotal moment. The headlines are really flashing with, frankly, quite a negative story around the transatlantic relationship. Today, we're going to tell a slightly different one. We're going to tell the story of the economic relationship, the ties that bind Europe and the United States. And so let's take a look, actually, with this short video at the state of the transatlantic economy today in 2026. Let's take a look. And so if there is one number we're taking away, certainly from this year's report, is 9.8 trillion. That is the value of the transatlantic economy. I mean, little needed to say, it's the largest, the most integrated, frankly, the most consequential economic relationship in the world. And that you see really in the numbers from the report. What you're looking at now is a comparison between different parts of the world as we're looking at the relationship between US and a range of regions around the world. We're looking at two things. We're looking at both trade, the goods and the services that are kind of going across potentially the US and Europe, or the US and, say, Mexico and Canada. But we're also looking at sales. And I think that's an important element to understand the deep economic integration between Europe and the United States. It's not just trade, it's not just the goods and the services going across the Atlantic, it's also the sales. It's basically American companies that have set shop in Europe, have affiliates here that operate as European companies deeply integrated in the market, but also the other way around. European companies that have found great opportunities in the US have created companies over there and operate from the US as a market. And so that's the reason why you see that kind of first bar on the chart that really shows the importance of the sales that are done by American companies in Europe, European companies in the US. You look at the third bar, you see the value of the trade, the fourth bar, sorry, the value of the trade relationship between Europe and the United States. So I think it's extremely important to understand just how deeply interconnected we are. And as you compare with other regions in the world, the relationship that the US has with Europe is just unparalleled. If we're looking at 2025 specifically, despite a lot of the turbulence, of course, that we've been seeing, especially in the political relationship, as we're looking at trade flows potentially being redefined around the world as U.S. trade policy evolves, we're seeing actually a record-breaking year. You look at numbers when it comes to trade between Europe and the US in both goods and services, record-breaking. You look at affiliate performance. So how well European companies in the US are doing, how well American companies in Europe are doing, record numbers. And you look at energy, which of course, especially in the current environment, as we're looking at, the disruption coming from the Middle East, and parallel and match in terms of the importance of that energy partnership between Europe and the US. So those numbers are extremely impressive and just show the density and the importance of that economic relationship. If we look at investment flows, it is similar. We're looking at US FDI, foreign direct investment, coming out of the US, going to different parts of the world. We're seeing over the years, 56% of that US FDI goes to Europe, 17% to Asia Pacific, 13% to Canada and Mexico. Again, really showing that at the end of the day, Europe is the main destination for US FDI around the world. To give you just a quick stat, US FDI in Europe in stock, if you look at the history, is 3.5 times more than US FDI investment in Asia Pacific. Really impressive. It's also true the other way around. If you're looking at how foreign companies have invested in the US, you're seeing really how the presence of European investments is important to the US economy. EU foreign direct investment in the US actually double than the Asian investment that you find in the United States, again, making the point of that mutually beneficial economic relationship that we're seeing across the Atlantic. If we're comparing, I was making the point earlier, sales and actually exports that are being made between Europe and the US, again, we're seeing incredible numbers there. US affiliates, US companies in Europe are actually really compared selling a lot of products and services in Europe compared to how much they're shipping across the Atlantic. So that also says something about, and I'll get to that in a second, some of the policy conversation that is very focused on trade and sometimes misses a bit of a big part of what that economic relationship is about, which is ultimately companies on both sides of the Atlantic deeply integrated and doing business. If we look at it the other way around, we look at European companies that are invested in the US, but we're also looking at European trade and exports going to the US. And we see there, again, the difference, how much that economic relationship is also driven by companies operating in each other's market, deeply integrated. At the end of the day, when you look at the performance of those companies, we're seeing here how important, again, each other are. So therefore, we're looking at how American companies are operating around the world and their earnings, 54% of the profits of US companies actually being made in Europe compared to other parts of the world. Again, Asia Pacific only represents 22% in comparison. If we're looking at the US and how international companies have been operating there, we're seeing that actually, if you look at all of the global earnings by foreign companies, there 41% actually come from the European Union, again, making the point of that deep integration. The value of the relationship is true for Europe as a whole, for the EU, it's true for the US, but it's also true for the states and the member states. If we're looking at both sides of the Atlantic, we're looking at here the numbers for Greece, again, making the point of how much Greece as a member state benefits from the deep connection that exists with the United States. Importantly as well, what we're looking at here is direct impact. What's important as well is all of the value that's generated as a result of those connections. As we're looking at the supply chains, we're looking at the indirect impact of companies investing and how that ultimately benefits communities, in this case in Greece. And that's a story that is true and needs to be told all around Europe, really, about the importance of the relationship. Where does that leave us right now from a political standpoint and policy standpoint? We have a deal that was struck back in August. It's almost a year from now between Europe and the United States. President von der Leyen, President Trump agreed to this trade framework between Europe and the US. It's taken quite a bit of time to implement for a range of reasons, with the political priorities on both sides as well, and some of the geopolitical turbulence we've experienced. It's actually a very important day today. We have in Europe, the European Parliament and the member states that are negotiating today on one small part, but important part of this larger framework agreement, looking at tariff reduction proposals. Hopefully, the EU today can agree to the final implementation of those tariff reduction proposals so that we can actually move on with the rest of the deal that was struck in Scotland that looks at a lot more than tariffs. It looks at cybersecurity and what we can do together. It looks at supply chain resilience, critical minerals. So a range of other things that would ultimately benefit companies, citizens operating on both sides of the Atlantic. So for us, that's a really big milestone today, hopefully with some good news coming out of Strasbourg, actually, where the meeting will take place later today. And with that, Elias, happy to go back to you, see if you've got any questions as we're looking at those numbers together.
Very much, Thibaut. Thank you really for this very informative, let's say, preview of the economic report. And also thank AmCham EU for its valuable contribution to that. Speaking about policymakers, since you mentioned this, which data point or trend in this year transatlantic economic overview do you believe deserves more attention from policymakers, both sides of the Atlantic, right?
I think certainly often there is a really big focus on trade specifically, and sometimes it gets kind of missed in the political priorities and the headline, how much investment actually drive the relationship. And investment doesn't just happen one day from another. It's really over the years, the commitment of a lot of companies on both sides that have seen opportunities, frankly, in the European market or the US market, and have created very integrated operations overall with supply chains that are, deeply integrated with goods and parts coming out, but also ultimately with those companies operating in each other market. Concretely, from a policy perspective, what does it mean? It means that for American companies operating in Europe, but also European companies operating in the US, they all need an environment that is ultimately conducive to growth, to innovation on both sides of the Atlantic. And so, when we focus on the transatlantic relationship, we look at trade and it's important and we need to find ways to facilitate that. But we also need to bring that conversation about actually how do we strengthen the case for investing, whether it's in the US or in Europe, and also not thinking that it's a zero-sum game, that if a company decides to invest in the US, they're only going to invest in the US. Or if they decide to make an investment in the EU, they're only going to invest in the EU. As we're seeing, our companies are looking at a range of places around the world, frankly, and sometimes also outside of the transatlantic relationship, and thinking, okay, where does it make sense for us to drive a project? And I think bringing the conversation back to how do we strengthen the case for investing in the transatlantic economy would be valuable.
Continuing about policymakers, you're in Brussels, so I guess continuously you're in contact, with policymakers there, but also you had the opportunity to travel to US, and actually, the last travel with our, AmCham in Europe Association, we had several meetings there. So my question is, how do policymakers in Europe and US perceive the outcome of this report, and generally the relations? And if the numbers mean differently to them, how their perception is the same? Because to my understanding and to many people, sometimes there's a different perception, from both sides,
Yeah, I think both sides recognize the importance of the relationship. I think our role as the business community as well is to make sure that just remains really high on the agenda. And I think as policymakers on both sides have to deal with a wide range of priorities, ultimately, it's also our job to go back and say, well, look at the value of that relationship, the reason why we all need to invest. And so I think, the importance of that economic relationship isn't necessarily questioned. I think our struggle currently is to find ways for Europe and the United States to align their political priorities. And so to find ways to ensure that as we develop policies on both sides, we think about, okay, well, actually, where does it make sense that we do more work together? So let me give you one example. We've seen 2 weeks ago now, Europe and the EU and the US signing an agreement on critical minerals, thinking actually if we want to enable the digital transition, more low carbon technology, we actually need those critical minerals. And it makes a lot of sense for the EU and the US, frankly, to work together with some other allies to make sure that ultimately our companies are able to benefit from those and to use those as we enable those transition on both sides. And there isn't a big kind of reason for us to compete. Frankly, there is a reason for us to work together. And I think that's maybe helping both sides continuing to see the value as opposed to maybe the negatives of working together, because frankly, that relationship is too big to fail when you look at the numbers.
And I think this is our role as well as AmChams, to try, to maybe translate, to each one's language, numbers, and also advocate, for these relations as the most we can. Thank you, Thibaut, for the very comprehensive overview of the study. And I guess, you will stay connected because you might have some questions by the audience later. So you might, step in, to answer some of those questions. But thank you again.